Hey friends, welcome back to Movies in a Bottle, where we're continuing our spooky season by breaking down The Mummy. This is a personal and fan favorite, but I think you're also going to learn something because I dug up plenty of interesting trivia. Remember to subscribe if you like the weekly breakdowns we do around here, but with all that being said, let's roll film. This epic adventure begins all the way back in ancient Egypt in Thebes, city of the living, while under the rule of Pharaoh Seti I. Also in Thebes was the Pharaoh's high priest and keeper of the dead, Imhotep, as well as the Pharaoh's mistress that no other man could touch, Ankh-Senamun. But it was Imhotep and Ankh that had fallen in love, and they were willing to risk it all for their secret rendezvous. Their romance came to an untimely end one day after Seti returned home early and caught them together. With his own sword, they took the Pharaoh's life to keep their secret, but his guards were close behind, so Ankh sent her lover away, knowing he would be the only one that could resurrect her, and he promised that he would. Then Ankh tragically took her own life in a final act of defiance, while Imhotep's loyal priest ushered him away. The high priest later took Ankh's body to Hamunaptra, city of the dead, where Imhotep would risk angering the gods by using the Book of the Dead to bring back his departed lover. He would have gotten away with it too, if it weren't for the Pharaoh's meddling guards. As punishment, Imhotep's priests were executed and he suffered the Hamdai, a curse so horrible it had never been used before, but he would now remain trapped between life and death, eternally being eaten by scarabs. If this monster were to ever rise again, he would unleash a devastating plague upon mankind, so the Pharaoh's guards, now the Magi, devote themselves to containing him. Behind the scenes, they briefly covered the history of the franchise, saying that after the hugely successful Dracula movie, Karl Freund followed it up with The Mummy. And since it was also made with Universal Studios, they got Boris Karloff, who played Frankenstein's monster, to play Imhotep. But after making a few of those, the franchise sat dormant for decades, until Universal Studios tapped Steven Sommers to direct and Industrial Light and Magic to deliver the state-of-the-art special effects. 3,000 years later, in 1923, the Magi still guard the cursed tomb, and they watch as our dashing hero, Rick O'Connell, and his cowardly comrade, Benny, hold the line against a horde of Tuareg warriors charging at them on horseback. Moments ago, Rick was promoted to the captain of this expedition that stumbled upon the fabled City of the Dead that had long since been rumored to be buried by the sands of time. And while Benny runs for the hills and hides in a tomb, Rick fights tooth and nail, using several guns that he has on him to hold back the attackers. Eventually, the horsemen back him against a wall, but then they abruptly leave. Turns out Rick had his back against an Anubis statue, and they were right to be stricken with fear because once alone, Rick hears whispering that he will die, and a screaming face appears on the sand. On the cliffside above, the Magi are relieved that the creature was not discovered, and their leader, Ardith Bey, decides not to end Rick to keep their secrets because the desert should take him soon anyways. Cut to 3 years later in 1926. Now in Cairo, Egypt, we meet the lovely librarian, Evelyn, or Evie, or Eve, all the same person, but she's hard at work cataloging books, but after she reaches just a bit too far to put one away, she knocks down a shelf, which knocks down another, and another, until the whole library is wrecked. The curator enters, obviously flabbergasted, and exclaims that Eve is the worst plague of all, and grumbles why he even puts up with her. She reminds him that she can read and write ancient Egyptian and Hieratic, and she's the only one within 1,000 miles that could properly catalog and code this place. Dismissing all that, he demands that she just clean this mess up. And no special effects or gimmicks were used for Eve destroying this library. If anything went wrong, they'd have to spend a couple of days resetting. During an on-set interview, Brendan Fraser described his backstory, saying that Rick was a French Foreign Legionnaire, but now he's a thrill-seeking soldier who escapes death as a daily ritual. And Rachel Weisz had a funny moment in her on-set interview, saying that to prepare for her role as Evelyn, the Egyptologist librarian, she bought a bunch of books on the subject, including How to Read Hieroglyphics, which she said she never even opened. Man, I love Rachel Weisz so much. I will never forgive Hollywood for making the third one without her. And if you didn't know, the French Foreign Legion is hardcore. That's what Bear Grylls was in. Eve hears a noise where the larger artifacts are held and goes to check it out. After following the noise, a freaking mummy springs out at her. Nah, it's just her goofball brother Jonathan, but she's not in the mood for him because of her library mishap and being rejected by the Bembridge scholars again for not having enough field experience. However, Jonathan brought her something to cheer her up, and after quickly examining it, Evie discovers a map to Hamunaptra, which she believes belonged to Pharaoh Seti I, the wealthiest pharaoh of them all. The siblings show the curator, but he continues to be dismissive of Evie and her theories on the map because he thinks it's all just myths and fairy tales. Eve relents that she's heard the stories of cursed mummies too, but her research indicates the city was real. However, that doesn't stop the curator from trying to burn the map to dissuade them from chasing legends. To learn more about this map, they need to go where Jonathan found it, and it's not a dig in Thebes like he said at first. He actually got it from pickpocketing someone at a bar. That someone is now in jail, and that someone is also Rick O'Connell, looking worse for wear. They tiptoe asking about his puzzle box, but he cuts to the chase, saying they're here to learn about Hamunaptra. They are confused that someone who surely can't read the map knew where it led, but he admits that he found it while he was actually inside the City of the Dead. Then Rick recognizes John and gives him the old what for through the bars, but when Evie Evie gets close to inquire more, the scoundrel steals a kiss. While being dragged away, he proposes to be their guide if she gets him out of this prison. Evie will have to think of something quickly because Rick is up next for the gallows. She tries and fails to bribe the warden, so the execution continues. Miraculously, Rick survives the drop, and with a few precious seconds Eve was granted, she does a bit of savvy negotiating, saving Rick's life in exchange for the 25% of the treasure they find whenever he takes them to Hamunaptra. This one's somewhat widely known at this point, but if you weren't already aware, Brendan Fraser wanted the hanging scene to look convincing, so he asked for a tighter noose, and then passed out for real during filming. But thankfully he woke up just a little bit later without any lasting physical injuries. Yeah, I'd say that's pretty convincing. John and Evie later regroup with Rick, who again looks like his former dashing self, and the two men agree to let bygones be bygones now that they're adventuring together. Just before they set sail down the Nile, Evie is beyond disappointed to see that the warden is also coming to secure his investment. They set sail, but at night we see that they aren't alone as the Magi follow close behind under the cover of darkness, still protecting the secrets of that cursed city. Rick finds John gambling with some rival American adventurers, and they bet $500 that they'll get to the city first. Turns out John and his loud mouth told them about their plans, so Rick takes the bet, but the rivals are confident because they have a guy that's been there before. Rick whacks John before he can divulge anything further, and he leaves to find Eve reading alone. He startles her by unrolling his gunny sack to reveal an arsenal, and he explains that there's an evil out there that even the locals believe in. She thinks all that stuff's hokum, but she's here because she believes the legendary book of Amun-Ra that contains secret ancient Egyptian incantations is buried out there. As they talk, Eve is impressed at Rick's knowledge of history, and she asks why he kissed her. But lacking any degree of tact, Rick says that he was about to be hanged, so it seemed like a good idea at the time, and she naturally storms off. Rick finds his traitorous friend Benny hiding nearby and learns that he is the rival's guide. Of course, Benny is just here for the money, but Rick explains that he's here to repay Evelyn. Then he chucks Benny overboard for being rude, and we get our first "Goodbye, Benny" of the movie. But Rick notices a problem. There are wet footprints leading up to Evie. The Magi are interrogating her for the map, which she gives them, but she's confused whenever they ask her about a key. Rick bursts in to rescue her, but then a fire quickly breaks out in the exchange of gunfire. A Magi sees the puzzle box and calls it the key, but Jonathan comes in just in time to see the one with the hook grab it. Meanwhile, Rick comes out guns ablazing to collect his arsenal and lead Evie to safety. John sees the Americans blasting the Magi away, but the one with the key makes one final charge at him before going overboard. However, our trusty pickpocket was sure to nab the key back just in time. After leaving the flaming ship, Rick, Evelyn, John, and the warden collect themselves on the bank of the Nile and listen to Benny taunting them about having all the horses. But that's okay because, say it with me now class, he's on the wrong side of the river. The next day at a Bedouin trading outpost, Rick makes John buy camels while Evie finds something to replace the nightgown that she escaped in. The party rides into the desert in search of Hamunaptra, but soon night falls. Rick gently adjusts Eve so she can continue to sleep, but looking at a ridge above, he again sees the Magi looking down upon him, Ardeth commenting that this one is strong. Just before the sun rises, Rick's group meets with Benny's, and the rivals remind Rick of the $500 wager to the ones that reach the city first. And speaking of, everybody but Rick and Benny are astonished to see a distant mirage fade as the sun rises above the horizon to reveal Hamunaptra. The rivals are still confident because they have all the horses, but Evie leaves them all in the dust by expertly marching her camel, almost as if she'd done this before. During the race, Benny was hitting Rick trying to get ahead, so Rick checked him off with our second "Goodbye, Benny." Upon reaching the city, Benny's group starts excavating a more obvious path under the direction of the Egyptologist, who tells the party not to worry about Rick's excavation because what could a woman know after all? Meanwhile, Evie studies the statue that Rick heard those voices from 3 years ago and says the Bembridge scholars believe the book of Amun-Ra is buried somewhere beneath it. Rick continues to charm Evie by gifting her some excavation tools, then they rappel down into the chambers of the buried city. Our resident librarian puts her knowledge to the test by using mirrors to reflect sunlight to illuminate the large room, and they are definitely on the right track because this is where mummies are made, and as they go further inside, they hear what sounds like an army of bugs in the walls and something just around the corner. Suddenly, they're in a standoff with the Americans, who aren't willing to share the find. Rick is ready to fight here and now, but Eve notices something below and reassures Rick that there's other places to dig. She made the right call because after the Egyptologists make the diggers open the cache, smoke bursts out and melts their skin. Ew. Back over to Evie, she led her group to below the statue where, according to the hieroglyphics, there should be a secret compartment with the book. Evie goes on to explain how mummies' organs are kept in sacred jars, while Jonathan gets a little overzealous swinging his pickaxe around and hits a wall to reveal a sarcophagus. She notes that being buried beneath Anubis meant you were either really important or did something really terrible. Studying it further, Rick notices a strange lock and Eve realizes this is why the Hook Magi called the puzzle box a key. Before they can investigate it any further, they hear screaming nearby. The warden had gone off on his own little side quest for treasure, and after crawling through some narrow tunnels, he finds a wall laden with scarabs made from rare blue gold. He collected them, but after one of them touched the sand, a real scarab emerged and immediately crawled under the warden's skin. He screams and runs for help, but all Rick's group can do is watch as he charges headfirst into a wall. So I don't have a great way to tell you this, but if you've seen The Mummy, you've been flashed by the guy that plays the warden, Omid Jalili. No joke, whenever he's saying, help me, his Johnson slips out for just a split second. I guess the actor just didn't have underwear on that day, and they said this was the most usable footage they had, even after editing. Our party, now down to 3 members, sits around a campfire before bed and wonders if perhaps this curse is real. Eve again shuts that nonsense down, but suddenly they're attacked by the Magi on horseback. Rick charges into battle, Eve holds her own, and Jonathan predictably needs saving. By holding a lit stick of dynamite, Rick fends off the attacker, who turns out to be Ardith, and he calls off his men but warns that everyone has one day to leave this place or die. Both groups wisely decide that just at night they should join forces. Rick and Evie find themselves winding down together at what must have been an exhausting day. Evie's clearly had a drink or 12 to take the edge off, and she eloquently points out that Rick must be wondering what a place like her is doing in a girl like this. While showing Rick photos from her locket, she shares that her father was a famous explorer who loved Egypt, and her mom was even an Egyptian adventurer herself. Rick admits that he still doesn't understand what drives her, and she proudly declares that she is a librarian and that she's going to kiss him now, but she passes out on her way in. So close, Rick, so close. The next day, Benny's group goes back to opening the cache that, previously melted people, and the Egyptologist notices a curse on it and reads it aloud. Death will come on swift wings to whomsoever opens this chest. A hiss echoes throughout the chamber that sends the diggers running for their lives, but he reads on, and the rest basically says that a mummy's gonna come back and regenerate by slurping down the organs of everyone who opened this chest. And if all that's not bad enough, once he's alive again, he will bring plagues upon the earth. Benny heeds the curse and runs away, but the others aren't as wise and they open the chest. Rick's group has returned to the sarcophagus with a weird key, and of course, they open it. The mummy jump scares the hell out of him, and the guys realize in unison that somehow this ancient corpse is still juicy. Adding to the confusion, they see scratch marks from inside the coffin with a message that death is only the beginning. Almost on cue, the group above finds the infamous Book of the Dead using the same strange lock, along with some exquisite gold jars. I wonder what's in those. Both parties come together that night to discuss their digs, and Eve notices the Egyptologist holding the Book of the Dead and then tells everyone that their mummy suffered the hum-die, and how supposedly, if he were to come back, he'd bring back the 10 plagues of Egypt. After everyone is asleep, Eve gets curious and swipes the book from their rivals, and Rick makes himself known by reminding her that that's called stealing. She figures no harm can come from reading a book, so she pops it open, and the two brush off the totally normal hissing wind that follows, because that happens a lot around here, and she starts to read a passage aloud. The words echo through the halls below, and the creature that had successfully been contained for thousands of years roars to life. Too late, the Egyptologist warns her not to read from the book, but the locusts are already upon them. As everybody else escapes into the ruins, the Egyptologist holds the book and wonders, what have we done? So they had a handful of real locusts on this guy that they put into the refrigerator to quote-unquote make them dopey, but they added the rest digitally, of course. Anyways, in the chaos of the escape, a poor soul loses his glasses and gets left behind. Barely being able to see, he's unable to avoid his terrible fate at the hands of Imhotep. Meanwhile, everyone else is running for their lives from that swarm of bugs that they heard in the walls earlier, which of course were scarabs. John and Rick manage to escape on a ledge, but they get separated from Evie after she accidentally falls through a secret passage. Evie then calls out to someone that she sees ahead, but she's frightened to see that he has no eyes or tongue. Then if that wasn't bad enough, terror surges through her body as the mummy steps out from the shadows. But instead of attacking her, he calls her an ox on a moon? And this interaction kind of makes me wonder how much of this movie's plot is set into motion because the mummy first gobbled up eyes of someone with horrible vision. But Rick and the others interrupt this meeting, and after winning a quick screaming match, our hero uses his trusty boomstick to blast the monster and run away. Once outside, the Magi have returned, but instead of keeping their promise, they berate the explorers for awakening something that they had guarded for 3,000 years, and they return their blind friend. Even though Rick claims to have killed the monster, Ardith assures him that no mortal weapon will work. Back inside, Benny now appears to be on the chopping block as the mummy moves in to devour him. Benny frantically cycles through religious necklaces and chants, hoping that anything will save him, and just before it's too late, the monster recognizes Hebrew as the language of the slaves from his time. Deciding that he could be useful, Imhotep spares Benny and asks him, where are the rest of the jar? Stephen Summers said he knew he didn't want the typical slow shuffling mummy. He wanted something that was fast, dangerous, and terrifying. Then ILM talked a lot about how it was difficult to design a terrifying mummy that wasn't overly gory. But after amalgamating multiple pencil sketches, they rendered a digital version that they later created in real life so the various artists could use it as a baseline. But I think they did a great design, because I remember hearing about this movie when I was a kid and how scary it was supposed to be. But I remember coming away thinking it was more action. But I want to know what you think. Action or horror? After making it back to civilization, Evie feels duty-bound and perhaps a bit responsible for waking the mummy, so she wants to stay and find out how to stop him. However, Rick feels like he's fulfilled his part of the deal that they struck back in the prison, and frankly, he doesn't want to battle an evil supernatural mummy, so he'd rather cut his losses and live. And I can't blame him. Down at the bar, Rick bumps into his old friend and pilot from the service, Winston, who drunkenly rambles about wishing how he'd gone down in a blaze of glory, but Rick and the others don't really have time for that right now. Checking in upstairs, Benny has led the disguised mummy to the blind man so he could finish absorbing the rest of his vitality. Everyone else downstairs learns that evil's amongst them whenever all at once Their drinks turn to blood as they toast and fire starts raining down on them. Rick first makes sure that Evelyn is safe and sees Benny, but before he can learn anything from him, there's a monstrous roar upstairs. Rushing in, Rick sees the mummy rejuvenating in real time, so he starts blasting away, but Ardith was right. It's not very effective. The mummy once again goes after Eve, but luckily a house cat scares him off. I'd be keeping that cat with me from here on out if I was in this movie, but fun fact, Nick Dudman did the makeup for this movie, and he also just finished working alongside ILM on Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. To get answers, Eve takes everyone back to the museum where she works so she can ask the curator about what the heck is happening. They are first surprised to see Ardith Bay there, but they are more surprised to learn that the curator is a part of the Magi, guarding against Imhotep. Rick asks the two why the monster is afraid of house cats, and they explain that he'll only be scared of them until he's fully regenerated because they're the guardians of the underworld. Evelyn then asks why he called her hunks in a moon, and the Magi realize that he must still be trying to resurrect her after all these years, and Eve must be his human sacrifice. When agreeing to take on the titular role of the mummy, Arnold Vosloo said that, from Imhotep's point of view, this is a skewed version of Romeo and Juliet, and he intended to play it that way. The good guys realize that the High Priest's power is continuing to grow once he forces an eclipse to cover everything in darkness, so they start strategizing on their next moves. They know that the mummy is going to have to eliminate all those who opened the chest to satisfy the curse, and everyone is accounted for except the Egyptologist. Rick tries to take only the men to save the nerd, but Eve protests, so Rick has to lock her in a room with the Americans guarding her, which leaves John as his only reluctant backup. Rick finds Benny snooping through their stuff, so he roughs him up to learn that he's doing the mummy's bidding as a means to avoid his wrath. And he honestly didn't really have any other choice, but then Rick learns that the mummy is after the Book of the Dead, and Eve, to bring back his girlfriend. A blood-curdling scream distracts them, so Benny yeets himself out of a window. Below, our heroes see the mummy, now looking slightly more human, as he finishes looting the Egyptologist for another jar and the wicked book before unleashing a swarm of flying insects. Back in the hotel with Eve, one of the two remaining Americans gets completely obliterated by Imhotep when he flies through the window as a devastating sandstorm, then reappears looking distinctly more human now. The mummy sandmans his way through a lock where Eve is resting, and the monster kisses her, but before he can take her away, Rick crashes through holding a guardian of the underworld, aka a house cat. After retreating to the museum, Evie shares her theory that if the Black Book of the Dead is real and it brings people back from the dead, then the Golden Book of Amun-Ra might also be real and be able to destroy that monster. Now the issue is they don't know where that Golden Book is hidden, but Evie is going to study the hieroglyphics here to try and figure out where it is. However, the relentless mummy has enacted his final plague of controlling the townspeople to ominously chant his name and do his bidding. John leaves Evie and the others to prepare a getaway car, and he's almost caught, but he blends in by joining the chant just long enough to escape unnoticed. Inside, Evie is under immense pressure trying to study the hieroglyphics, but in a sudden burst of insight, she understands that the Bemberd scholars swapped the books, and furthermore, the Book of Amun-Ra is buried in Hamunaptra under a statue of Horus. So around the 1 hour, 23 minute, and 42 second mark, an extra that was carrying Benny kept looking at the camera, so they used special effects to white out his eyes in post-production. Everybody else joins John outside in the car, and they almost get away undetected, but Benny rats them out, and a chase ensues. They don't get far before they're surrounded by the crazy townspeople, but they're forced to floor it and hope for the best. While piling onto the car, the crazies quickly separate the final American from the group, and he suffers the same fate as the rest of his friends. Rick crashes the car during the chaos, and the followers back them into a corner. Imhotep emerges from the crowd, now fully restored, and Benny poorly translates for the mummy, who proposes that if Evie goes with him, he'll spare her friends. Without any clear option, Evie goes with the monster, and Benny retrieves the key before the followers are ordered to kill them all anyways. All hope seems lost, but then Rick notices a manhole cover below, and the curator gives his life to buy them a few precious seconds to get away. In the script, this is where Rick would have used the same dynamite that he held Ardith back with before removing its fuse and pocketing the explosive. But I guess that was cut because they probably didn't want to blow up townspeople. Now they're gonna need some help getting to Hamunaptra in time to save Evie, so they go to the Giza airstrip to ask an unexpected ally for assistance, Winston. He's easily convinced to join the mission after they mention the danger, and Rick simply explains that they need to save the damsel, kill the bad guy, then save the world. The men soar through the desert after the mummy, with Ardith and John on each wing, but it's not long before the villain drops off Evie and Benny to go on the offensive with another spell. With what feels like all the sand in the desert bearing down on them, our heroes do their best to survive the attack, but it doesn't look good for them, so Evie does something dramatic and kisses Imhotep to ruin the spell by breaking his concentration. They may not have died, but they did lose their plane, and oops, I think I spoke too soon because Winston got his wish of a heroic death in the end after all. They recover what little weapons and supplies they can from the plane before it succumbs to quicksand, and then Rick pays his respects before they continue. To fully realize the visual effects, ILM spent 2 days working with the mummy himself, Arnold Vosloo, on the scenes that he had just spent the last 6 months filming. And I like something Arnold said when working with ILM, and to summarize, he said that he didn't really know how the technology worked, and he didn't want to know. He just wanted to be given direction to the letter, and then he would come in and inject his performance. But he said ILM is the best in the business, and once you trust them, you can fly. Rick and the others are close behind the bad guys, but Ardith takes them to a collapsed tunnel that they're gonna have to dig out to sneak back inside Hamunaptra. Rick and Ardith are hard at work, and Jonathan stops annoying them just long enough to fall for that same trap the warden did with the blue scarabs on the wall, but luckily for the thief, Rick was here to cut it out. He then shoots it before it scurries back to them, but Imhotep certainly knows they're there now, and he chants another spell to awaken his undead minions. They venture further into a huge dark room, and Rick borrows a page from Evie's book and uses her mirror trick to illuminate the space and reveal the fabled treasure of ancient Egypt, thought to be buried forever. But they got company. Lesser mummies start emerging from the ground, and after Ardith explains that they're Imhotep's priests, the heroes do their thing and start blasting away. Jonathan even gets a piece of that action. After realizing they'll be overrun if they stay, the group retreats deeper into the tomb, leaving all this gold for Benny. With the mummies hot on their tail, they finally find the statue of Horus and the Book of Amun-Ra. However, it's clear to Ardith that our heroes won't have time to save Evie with the mummies closing in, so he gives Rick 2 instructions. Save the girl, kill the creature, before he heroically charges into the tunnel alone. Meanwhile, Eve is chained to a sacrificial altar next to the very dead Anck-su-namun, and Imhotep begins the ritual to bring her back. In ancient Egyptian, he chants, "With your death, Anck-su-namun shall live, and I shall be invincible." He's about to end Eve to complete this abominable ritual when Jonathan unknowingly saves her from her untimely demise by shouting that he found the book. She shouts that they'll need to open the book to vanquish the creature and that Imhotep has the key. Taking full advantage of the distraction was our daring hero, Rick O'Connell, who grabbed a sword from a statue to break Evie's chains and slash down Imhotep's minions in what was undoubtedly one of the coolest action sequences of the 90s. Rick drops his guard for just a moment and is nearly crushed, but thinks fast and grabs a severed hand of a mummy wielding his sword and escapes. Brendan Fraser shared his thoughts on special effects, saying there's an inherent disadvantage due to the awkwardness of acting alone, but he said that was also kind of an advantage too, because all the overacting like he felt like he was doing paid off whenever he'd seen the final product. He said there was another advantage whenever they did direct homage to Ray Harryhausen's skeleton fight from the Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. He said instead of having to pull his punch working with stuntmen, he got to put his all into the epic conclusion. Jonathan is none the wiser, so he runs and reads the front of the book, hoping something good will happen, but he unknowingly summons even more reinforcements for Imhotep to command. Then Anck-su-namun attacks Eve from behind, separating her from Rick, leaving him to deal with all the reinforcements alone. After definitively losing this screaming match, Rick retreats to higher ground while Eve fends off Ankh, and John fumbles through the rest of the inscription on the cover so he can gain control of the reinforcements that he summoned. Rick continues to hack and slash through the mummies, but eventually he starts to get overwhelmed. Making matters worse, Jonathan can't finish the complicated translation, so Evelyn, while barely surviving her attack from Ankh, helps her brother complete it with mere milliseconds before Rick was finished off by the minions. Then John rescues Evelyn and then infuriates Imhotep by sending what are now his minions to return Ankh to the afterlife. Predictably, the mummy moves to get revenge on Jonathan for having taken away his lover from him again, but whenever he lifts the pickpocket into the air, Jonathan steals the key back and Rick charges in and then disarms the monster. But Rick keeps the mummy busy, mostly by getting thrown around a lot, while the siblings try to find the incantation that will destroy Imhotep. Again, just before it's lights out for Rick, Eve finishes the right spell and Imhotep is horrified to see a spectral chariot appear and seemingly take his soul away with them. Still burdened by his quest to reunite with his beloved Anck-su-namun, the mummy continues his attack on Rick, who's confused about why the monster wasn't destroyed. But after our hero strikes down the once unkillable villain, Eve declares he's mortal now, before Imhotep sinks into the pool of souls, returning to his decayed form. Just before he withers away, he whispers, "Death is only the beginning." Somehow Benny isn't dead yet, but our traitorous friend proves one more ancient Egyptian legend true by setting his heavy bag of loot down on a lever and starting the fabled sinking of Seti's treasure. Rick wastes no time ordering everyone to escape, but John strikes out left and right, first by tripping and dropping the literal golden book, then by not having any time to get any of the pharaoh's treasure. However, he does get to leave with his life, which is more than we can say for Benny, who is barely too slow to get help from Rick. This is when we get our third and final goodbye, Benny. To pay for all of his misdeeds, Benny is left alone in the dark to be consumed by scarabs. Rick, Evelyn, and Jonathan barely make it out of Hamunaptra before it's completely swallowed by the sands of time, and then they find all the camels Benny had planned on using for his treasure hauls. Stephen Summers had originally intended Ardith to sacrifice himself, but he liked him so much that instead, he gives John one final jump scare and then sincerely thanks the heroes before taking his leave. Then while Jonathan groans about leaving yet another adventure empty-handed, Rick and Evelyn share a proper kiss before they all ride off into the distance, soon to discover that their old pal Benny loaded those camels with treasure after all. On one of those GQ videos for breaking down iconic roles, Brendan Fraser talked at length about how much he enjoyed making these movies and working with Stephen Summers. And he shared a pretty funny story too, saying that for big scenes, Stephen would often go, "Ready and don't suck, action." Then at the end of the segment, Brendan was asked if he would return for another one, and he excitedly answered, "Yeah, you got a script? Come on, Hollywood, give the people what they want." But that is a wrap on The Mummy. Remember to like and subscribe if you got something out of today's breakdown, and until I see you next week, y'all be good. Hey, you made it to the end. Remember, if you want to revisit any more of your favorite movies, check the links on screen, but otherwise, subscribe and I'll catch you for a new breakdown next week. Thanks.